Let me just begin by making a couple of introductory remarks. The first thing is that I think it would be fair to say, in contrast to both Eugenio and Peter, working with subjective well-being data isn't something I do. That's not my main area of research, or it's not even one of my areas of research. And in general, I'm actually far more skeptical in a sense of the users of such data for welfare purposes than either of them. The second remark I want to make is that for the purposes of this talk, I will be using a model which I will explain to the extent I can in words and in one point with diagrams, with some notation but no more than that, hopefully in a manner that's comprehensible. But in the context of that model, I will be using words that in some sense will overlap with the kind of with what Eugenio talked about. In particular, I will be talking about aspirations and aspiration failure, but you will see that there will be differences in the formal content that we can attach to those words in the context of specific models. So that will be different. I'll also be reporting some new field work that I have been doing with others in the context of poverty traps. So let me begin by talking about to give you an overview of my talk. So the first point I want to talk about a little bit, because this in a sense would relate more closely to what both Eugenio and Peter have talked about, is the use of happiness data as a measure of disadvantage. I know,
Negative happiness is a measure.
The sign, one can always attach whatever sign one wants to before a variable. But the idea would be that there would be to what extent can it be used as a measure of disadvantage. Then I'm going to talk about some work that I'm doing with colleagues at the center on an explanation of poverty traps and via aspirations failure. And then this is going to, in some sense, go beyond conventional accounts of poverty traps in a very specific way. And then I'm going to talk about this aspect, the second point, from both a conceptual stroke theoretical perspective, and I'm going to provide you with some preliminary data that we have been collecting in fieldwork in Kolkata and Argentina. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of this on the design of pro-poor policies. Okay, so that's going to be the content of my talk. Now, before I kind of get into the specific issue of happiness as a measure of disadvantage, I want to preface my remark with the following comment. And this is really not something that's directly related to this talk, but I think is kind of important to bring to the table in the context of the previous two speakers. And it is this: there are many situations where choice and preferences, so choice data and happiness data don't necessarily go together. Okay, classical examples of this are experiments carried out by attempts to look at the level of happiness that patients have gone through before an expensive medical operation. This was a study by Ubel and others who looked at a very expensive medical operation on the colon, and basically what they found is that reported happiness, subjective well-being, both before and after that operation were roughly the same, although in some sense people chose to do the operation if they could. And so in some sense, these are the kind of situations where the preferences that one would construct from the use from choice data would be very and then using those preferences to construct welfare metrics to justify, for example, subsidizing such operations or justify the public funding of such operations would lead to very different results if you then had to begin with used reported happiness before and after the operation as a measure of welfare. I think this particular point about the potential conflict between choices that people make and subjective well-being, I think I'm going to skip this slide because a lot of people have already talked about this, but perhaps we can come back to it afterwards. But I think that this particular point about the potential conflict between choice data and revealed preferences, and therefore the use of welfare metrics that are based on revealed preferences and subjective well-being, I think this is potentially a serious problem. It's a problem because much of economics and the way in which we use choice data to construct welfare metrics for public policy interventions is a well-established procedure. And the foundations of that go back to classical welfare economics in the 40s and 50s. And in much of that work, so for example, to give a concrete example, suppose you were to ask the question, is there too much or too many or too few supermarkets in a given neighborhood? Okay. Now, in order to answer that question, which is an important question for competition policy, typically what people will do is that they will go to estimated demand data. They'll use this estimated demand data to construct a measure of welfare, which is called consumer surplus. And then they will ask themselves, well, what kinds of, are there ways of intervention in either reducing capacity or increasing capacity, making entry more easy for supermarkets in a given neighborhood? How will that impact on consumer welfare, okay, on consumer surplus and consumer welfare? Now, this exercise is an exercise that is predicated on doing the following thing. You look at choice data, namely estimated demand functions. From that choice data, you construct a measure of welfare, namely consumer surplus, and then you use that welfare measure to evaluate the desirability of various kinds of public policy interventions. Happiness data is a totally different exercise. So what you do is you kind of look at reported subjective well-being in these large-scale surveys, and then you use the average of that reported subjective well-being before and after various interventions, and then you sort of talk about the desirability of those interventions in relation perhaps to the differences in reported subjective well-being before and after those interventions. And all I'm trying to point out is that there are cases where these two exercises can give you different answers. And then this will lead to a dilemma for policymakers, because so far at least, public policy interventions have used choice data and welfare metrics constructed from choice data to justify this or that intervention. This issue, I think, becomes particularly relevant when one talks about poverty and tries to think of happiness and the use of happiness as a measure of disadvantage. That's my own specific interest as a researcher. And there is a kind of a satisfaction paradox, if you wish. And the satisfaction paradox, it goes back to observations by Sen, who basically points out that actually, given that we live in a world with adaptive preferences, given that people choose reference groups with respect to which they evaluate their own income and their own welfare, given that these things are endogenous, then in a sense, one should not expect the reported levels of well-being for poor people to be very different from the general population. And this indeed turns out to be the case. One of the best examples and concrete examples of this that I have found is a wider study that's the World Institute for Development Economic Research by Rojas, who looked at some data for about 1,000 individuals in the vicinity, living in the vicinity of Mexico City. So it's not as if they were completely isolated group of population who didn't know the city, were not aware of modern life and the changes that were happening elsewhere. And in this study, Rojas basically looked at reported subjective well-being on a scale of 1 to 7, 1 being lowest, 7 being highest, and essentially found out that 90% of the respondents reported that they were either happy or very happy. Okay, but going by the measures, the objective measures of poverty as defined by the Mexican government, over 50% of those 1,000 individuals were poor. So you cannot, there is clearly a significant group of individuals in a situation that is of disadvantage by other more conventional measures like capabilities, access to health, nutrition, etc., etc. People who might even be willing to pay vast sums of money to exit from the situation of poverty, as demonstrated by migration and such other choices, but whose subjective reported well-being in terms of happiness or whether they're happy or not very happy, clearly most of them said that they were happy or very happy, and in a way that was not very different from the general population as a whole. So this I would call a satisfaction paradox. Okay, And I think that this is clearly, to my mind at least, shows that there is in principle a potential conflict between the use of subjective well-being data to talk about disadvantage and other measures of disadvantage as we normally conceive of it, namely choice, migration, etc., but also as kind of a more capability SEN type approach where one can measure deprivation on objective grounds like health, nutrition, school, sanitation, etc. And this, I suppose, the point of view I'm trying to push forward is that this is a problem. This is a problem because when you have such conflicting rankings coming from these different types of data, then either one has to be more subtle about the use of subjective well-being data in talking about economic welfare, and I'm sure Eugenio in particular and Peter will also perhaps argue that what is important about subjective well-being data are the changes. So the response to temporary shocks and so on, and one should not use this as a measure of welfare, but really in terms of what Peter talked about in terms of marginal utility or marginal happiness in response to shocks and changes. But that is a different argument, and I think it needs a different kind of data collection. It needs a more subtle use of this data and the use of this data relative to other more conventional sources of measuring welfare. That is a problem, and I think it needs to be properly addressed, especially given that the Office of National Statistics has undertaken this huge exercise to collect subjective well-being data for the whole of UK, and presumably the purpose of doing that is to, at some level, provide an alternative foundation for welfare foundation for economic policy. And precisely because of this, I think these potential sources of conflict and these issues of interpretation and the precise use to which one can put this kind of data becomes all the more important and debatable. So I think these are issues that one has to think about and debate very carefully and try and justify it on various grounds. The other point I want to make is that unhappiness is not necessarily a bad thing. In most so to give you a slightly more individualistic example and then a social example, at an individualistic example, there are a lot of mountaineers, people who love climbing mountains, for whom the passion is to climb mountains. They are typically, they're miserable when they actually are doing it. You're cold, you're wet, your limbs are aching, your muscles are aching, okay? You're miserable when you're doing it, okay? But you still want to do it, all right? I know it because, after a long break, I've started going back on the treadmill myself. And I can tell you that, the last 10 minutes of a 1 hour workout on a treadmill is one of the most miserable things that can happen to you as an individual. It's horrible. You want to stop. You want to do anything in the world but that, okay? But you still do it. You still do it because in some sense you take into account the fact you trade off this miserability at that point of time versus in some sense so it's an intertemporal trade-off. So you trade off the miserability at that point of time for a gain in terms of your health over a longer period of time. Or the sense that you get when you achieve something that you've set out to do, that may be a medium-term objective, and you may be willing to sacrifice something in the medium term, which may be your current reported, your subjective well-being at a given point of time. So these intertemporal trade-offs are there, and therefore another point would be that even if happiness matters for welfare, it is perhaps a parameter in preferences rather than the preferences themselves. So if you think of this in a purely temporal sense, then I think that becomes an issue as well. I think from a more from the point of view of society as a whole, the fact that a large group of people's expectations and aspirations are not fulfilled, that this leads to frustration on their part, can be a powerful engine for political and social change. The fact, think of the Arab Spring, okay? Now, much of what's happening in the Arab Spring would not happen if young people living in those societies were happy and content with their lot. It is precisely because they're not happy and content with their lot. It is precisely because they live in a globalized world where their aspirations and expectations are set high, but the conditions in which they live are in some sense not good, and so that leads to frustration, that leads to unfulfilled aspirations, an aspirations gap. It leads to unfulfilled expectations. It is precisely because of that there is a powerful political agency there for driving change. Okay, so that kind of change may be a good thing, and there is no reason why we should privilege happiness as measured by subjective well-being data over these other things that are actually as important in terms of human, in terms of what it means to be human, in terms of social organization, political organization. There's no particular reason why we should, put one on a pedestal and then kind of use because that can kind of blind us to other things. So this is in a sense my sort of set of preliminary remarks, and it kind of, I guess, encapsulates this point that I am in general a bit more skeptical about these matters than other things. I think it's an excessively individualistic measure. Even at the level of the individual, I think there are caveats that one can impose, but the minute one brings in society as a whole and one looks at individuals in the context of their social, in the social context, in a political context, I think these things change a lot. So, but that is not to say, of course, that that there isn't important information that is contained in this happiness data. The fact that happiness data correlates, with all the usual caveats that you would attach in a careful econometric exercise. The fact that happiness data correlates with things that most of us would intuitively, instinctively identify as being important for human welfare carries important scientific information. And I think that part of it is a useful, deep exercise that one has to understand and explain and account for. But the leap from that to the use of such data for welfare purposes is a different matter. So I think that the two things, in some sense, have to be kept distinct. Just to emphasize this point about the scientific importance of an exercise that looks at such data, it's very interesting. So, for example, one can use such data to talk about the importance of taking measures for environmental purposes, which one would not if you use conventional choice data, precisely because the environment is an externality, and in a context with externalities, it's well known that choice data may not reveal all the relevant information that we need to construct an appropriate welfare metric. And in such cases, happiness may actually, give us important information that the choice data on its own would not. So I have a skeptical take, but all I'm trying to say is that there are reasons to be nuanced and subtle about this, but one shouldn't go overboard in one direction or the other. Now, my starting point, I kind of preface this stuff, the things that I'm going to present with this small discussion on happiness, because I wanted to relate happiness as a measure of disadvantage. But in some sense, if you think of disadvantage as it is talked about in economics in the context of poverty traps, then essentially the dominant view in economics is that this is essentially driven by constraints that are external to the individual. Okay? And there is a long and distinguished tradition in economics which focuses precisely on this. I haven't put down the precise references, but for each of these points, for example, credit market imperfections, there is probably a whole body of work, both theoretical and empirical, that has shown that in the context of credit market, that credit market imperfections and the fact that in the presence of credit market imperfections, the initial wealth of an individual can limits the amount of collateral an individual can put up in order to borrow money from these imperfect credit markets. This in some sense can perpetuate poverty traps, can disadvantage and perpetuate disadvantage for already disadvantaged individuals. So this is a well-known finding, both theoretical and empirical, and a lot of people have looked at it. So pure nutrition is another one. This work goes back to the 50s. Nelson, amongst others, your position in important social networks. This has a big role in terms of whether a situation of initial disadvantage is sustained over a long period of time. However, in all this work, there is an implicit assumption. The assumption is that the difference between somebody who is poor and somebody who is not is basically their initial income, or their initial social status, but in some sense, the quality of decision making, that is whether is the same whether you are a poor person or whether you are a rich person. So there is no difference. So status makes no difference. Income makes no difference in the kind of decision making that you make. So it is poor but rational. Now, a different view of poverty is one which, and I think dangerous, and let me point out to you why it can be dangerous, but a different view of poverty is that essentially persistent poverty is driven by internal constraints. By internal constraints, I mean that in some sense, not only is it the case that the poor are disadvantaged in terms of their external conditions, but also in terms of various internal constraints that are internal to an individual in a state of poverty. Now, the reason why it is dangerous is because of surveys like this, which say that, for example, 60% of Americans think that the poor are lazy or lack willpower. Okay? So in some sense, the idea here is that people who are lazy and lack willpower self-select themselves into a situation of poverty. Okay? So the fact that a poor person is unable to make certain choices or certain decisions is not surprising, because essentially what's going on is you have a kind of an economy, social-wide sorting process, and it is essentially people who are unable to make rational choices or have internal constraints of one kind or the other who are self-selected into poverty. And that's the reason why it is dangerous. And then that leads automatically to positions like the distinction between deserving and undeserving poor, etc., that all of us are familiar with in the context of contemporary political discussions.
That's presumably 60% of Americans think that poor Americans.
I agree. I should be careful. There's about poor Americans indeed, but it is surprising how these beliefs cut across cultural contexts. If you do this survey in India, I'm pretty sure you'll get similar results. That is, the middle class living in urban areas in India probably think of the poor in India exactly in similar terms. So I wouldn't be, that wouldn't be, and there is data to back that up as well. So now there is some work which tries to look at this, which tries to formalize this idea. And the most important contribution along these lines is by Banerjee and Mullainathan, who have a paper in 2010, where what they do is they kind of look at a world where you have temptation. So the idea is that today, suppose I have a certain amount of income today, and I'm thinking of whether I should consume it or save it. But if I save it, I'm not sure what my future self tomorrow will do with it. It may spend it on things that I don't like. Okay. So in some sense, this will limit the amount of savings I'm willing to make. I'd rather spend it on consumption today than save it, hand it give it in the control of my future self. I don't trust my future self to do the right thing, so I kind of consume it today because I trust myself today more than I trust my future self tomorrow. Now, if to this you add the assumption that the shape of temptation is configured in a particular way, and by that I mean that essentially the poorer you are, the more you are the less likely you are to trust your future self to do the right thing, and the richer you are, the more likely it is to be the case that you will trust your future self to do the right thing. So if the shape of temptation is configured in this fashion, then quite obviously you see that this leads to a poverty trap, because in some sense you have low income. Because you have low income, you don't trust your future self, which means you consume more today and save less. But then this leads to a situation where you kind of tend to have low income tomorrow, day after, and so on and so forth. So that kind of thing, the fact that the combination of temptation with the fact that everybody is tempted. So there's not that as if the rich and the poor are different in terms of the fact that whether they're tempted or not, but the shape of temptation may change. So this can lead to poverty traps. There is a slightly more sophisticated explanation of this, which by Bernheim and Ray in a recent paper. I won't get into it. It's a more sophisticated explanation because it does not assume that somehow the shape of temptation is different whether you're rich or poor. It derives it from more primitive considerations. And to that extent, it has greater normative bite. Yes.
What about if you don't trust other people or the institution? Because like a rich person can put it in a nice savings account, the poor person might have to have it under the bed, and then things that get stolen. So it might not just be self-control; it could also be that everything around you don't trust. So if you have a good rather than money, this might be you think, oh well, I can send it tomorrow or something.
I agree with you, and I think that's a good point, and I'll come back to that point actually in this empirical exercise field work that I'm doing, where this is one of the issues that actually traps those poor marginalized individuals, keeps them in a situation of disadvantage, traps them in a situation. So I agree with you. I think that's a relevant point. Now. The other now studies, if there's a very interesting website, and I urge you to look at it if you have some time, which is on the World Bank, and this is about the voices of the poor. Okay, so these are actual recordings of people who are caught in a situation of chronic or persistent poverty, and the one thing that you get when you hear those recordings is this lack of hope. Okay, so clearly there is a sense in which persistent poverty goes with the idea that you lose hope. So there is this sort of this lack of hope seems to be a thing that the poor seem to mention as a key source of disadvantage, which is distinct and over and above other sources of disadvantage they face in their lives. Now, how can one think of this lack of hope? Now, in psychology, there is a notion of self-efficacy, and self-efficacy beliefs is basically this is a theory that goes back to Albert Bandura, who was probably one of your ex-colleagues at Stanford, Peter Bandura, famous psychologist. So he talked about self-efficacy beliefs, and this is the belief in the capacity to achieve desired outcomes through one's effort. Okay, there is a related notion, and not being a psychologist, I'm not sure why these things are labeled differently. So why these things are different in some sense would be useful to get, which is called locus of control. And locus of control can take either an internal measure or an external measure. And an internal measure is basically that a person feels that their future is a function of what they do. And an external measure is essentially that you believe that your future is a function of things that are not under your control, your circumstances. Okay? And it turns out that there is a steep income gradient in the internal measure of locus of control. So the richer you are, the more you feel your future is under your control. The poorer you are, the more you feel that in some sense things are determined by things that are exogenous to you. And this income gradient has been observed in many Western economies and also in the UK. In this study, the longitudinal study of young people, especially in the context of educational choices. So there is this persistent thing, and then there is this very interesting work by Appadurai, who is a social anthropologist, who looked at did some work with NGOs working in slum areas in Mumbai. And he came up with this concept of the capacity to aspire. Okay, so to him, this capacity to aspire concept is something like this. It's basically the idea that somehow it's a navigational capacity, according to him. So what does it mean? It means that you have a clear sense of where you want to be, you have a sense of where you are, and you have a path and you perceive a path from where you are to where you want to be. Okay. So the combination of these three things is what he called the capacity to aspire. Okay, so in some sense, and he shows, or in a bunch of case studies, they are not large-scale survey data, but at least in the cases that he looked at, he showed that there was a positive association between individuals caught in a situation of persistent disadvantage and this lack of capacity to aspire. So the point I want to make here is that it matters what. So if you think that internal constraints are a source of disadvantage for the poor, then whether that should matter for policy purposes depends very much on the answer to the question whether or not you think that internal constraints are a cause or an effect of poverty. Okay, so the point is that is it that poverty persists because the poor lack hope and motivation to pull themselves out of poverty? So is there something about these individuals that they are self-selected into a situation of poverty, and these individuals to begin with lack hope and motivation, and therefore once they for whatever reason get into a situation of poverty tend to remain there? Or is it that in some sense the poor exhibit the same weaknesses and biases that people from other walks of life, except that in poverty the same behaviors lead to worse outcomes? So the point here is that there is no big difference between the rich and the poor. So one can take another difference that if there are biases, systematic biases, if there are systematic departures from rationality in decision making, then this is the common feature that cuts across the entire population. It is just that there is something about poverty that means that these biases have a bigger bite and therefore become in their own right an additional source of disadvantage over and above that is dictated purely by external constraints. So what we do is with colleagues, I have done some work where we look at this, we examine this interaction between poverty and individual weakness and bias, and whether it can explain the psychology of the poor and their aspirations failure. I realize that it is 11:52, so I am instead. So let me just give you a little bit about, there is a bunch of papers which there's considerable evidence that beliefs, aspirations, and poverty go hand in hand. There is also evidence that poverty and low aspirations go hand in hand. There is also evidence that pessimism and low aspirations in some sense are a consequence of poverty, and there is evidence of this bunch of papers. So I'm not going to talk about these papers in great deal of detail because I want to talk to you about the evidence that we have got from our own fieldwork. But essentially there is an existing literature out there. This literature looks at field experiments of various kinds, or they look at large-scale survey data. But what I'm going to present to you in terms of the fieldwork that we have done, the very preliminary results of that fieldwork will be different in their emphasis. So there is a conceptual framework that underlies this fieldwork. This conceptual framework is formalized in the context by using a particular model. So what we do is in this framework we make the following assumptions. Okay, so the first assumption is that preferences are reference dependent, where the reference point is a person's aspiration level. Okay, so this I think is slightly different actually from a purely formal modeling viewpoint from what you have, Eugenio, if I understand it correctly. So the idea is that when preferences are reference dependent, then what happens is that an individual will evaluate their outcomes not only in terms of the intrinsic worth of that outcome on its own right, but also in some sense in terms of the gains and losses of that outcome relative to the reference point. Okay, so that will matter. We'll assume that both the rich and the poor have the same preferences, and essentially they draw from the same distribution of initial aspirations or innate ambitions. The second point, and this is an important point, and it's some sense key to what we are doing, and that's the sense in which you have bounded rationality or a departure from full rationality in what we do. We assume that aspirations are endogenous reference points. So what do I mean by that? I mean the following. Just take my own case. When I was a graduate student in economics, all I was aware of essentially was that if I had to write this paper to get a job, okay, or I had to study to clear my exams, okay, I wasn't aware, and I hadn't certainly fully internalized the fact that doing these things would have a long-term consequence. The long-term consequence being that eventually I would become, for whatever it's worth, a professor of economics, or write papers of the kind that I do at this point of time. But the fact is that those actions did have these consequences. The fact that I am where I am today is a function of the things I did in the past. But when I did those things in the past, the fact that I will be where I am today is not something I fully internalized. I certainly internalize the immediate consequences of my actions, namely passing an exam, getting a job, but not these medium-term consequences. Okay? I think it's fair to say that most of us share this bias. And I don't think that the poor are different in this regard. Okay? I think if you think about it, the fact that I do something today, this has an immediate consequence, and that in some sense this then can have this kind of medium-term consequence. The fact that you don't internalize this fully is not something that is, I think, it's a common bias that a lot of people share, whether you're rich or poor. So what we'll assume is essentially that there is a feedback effect from effort and actions to aspirations, but that this feedback effect is not fully internalized, whether you're rich or poor. Okay? And this is the behavioral bias in setting aspirations that is key to our model. So the idea here is that aspirations evolve with effort. So every ceiling, when it's reached, becomes a floor. I mean, Aldous Huxley, for those of you who like Huxley, sort of is an interesting point in this regard. In setting their life goals, individuals recognize that higher aspirations require greater effort to be achieved, but do not anticipate that aspirations evolve with effort through the outcomes that are realized along the way. There is evidence of this in that Easterlin, people underestimate how preferences evolve as their income changes over their lifetime. There is also evidence that, for example, migrants underestimate how their preferences adapt with their location, ending up less happy than the rural and urban non-migrants. So this ability not to fully internalize the consequences of actions on medium-term things is something that I would suggest is recommended. So now the point here is this. So what is the mechanism? So how does poverty cause aspiration failure? Well, the idea is that suppose a poor person draws the same initial aspiration as a rich person, and both of them choose effort levels taking their aspiration as given. Okay? But a poorer person chooses lower effort for a given aspiration level because greater risk reduces his expected marginal benefit of effort relative to that of a richer person. Okay? However, aspirations evolve with effort, and hence in the long run, the poor person ends up further away from his best possible outcome than a rich person. In other words, a poorer person is more prone to aspirations failure. So in words, in a very heuristic sense, imprecise heuristic sense, this is the mechanism that the model sets out to, that the theory sets out to model and work out the consequences of that for aspirations and aspirations failure. So I had a diagram, but I think I'm going to skip it in the interest of time. There are some related papers on this, which I'm also going to skip. I want to go directly to this fieldwork that I'm doing in Calcutta. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that. So this work that I'm doing there is being done jointly with Anandi Mani, who is my co-author in the theory paper, but also Sanchari Roy, who is a postdoc at Cage. And it's also being done in collaboration with a NGO, which is it's a sex workers collective called Durbar, which in Bengali means essentially something that breaks boundaries. So you you push boundaries, you break boundaries. And Dr. Jana is who is also involved in this work. Essentially, is a key person in that NGO. Now, this NGO has been working with sex workers in Kolkata for a very long time, and they are well known in the field of health research because they pioneered the use of role models in the context of HIV prevention. They were one of the first NGOs that did that, as against a kind of a purely public service delivery model of AIDS prevention. And one of the things they did in that was in training the role models was these dream building exercises. So what is dream building? It's a fascinating thing. The first time I read it in Bengali, I was absolutely fascinated by it. So what is dream building? It's 8 sessions, okay? And the first session is essentially about treating sex work like work, no different from other kinds of work. The second session is about the distinction between wants and desires and dreams, okay? The third session is about distinguishing between short-term and medium-term dreams. The fourth session is about trying to understand a pathway from where you are to achieving your dreams. Okay? And then there are sessions which talk about collective means of achieving individual dreams. Okay? So this is literally dream building, and these sessions are specifically targeted at internal constraints because they don't really change anything else. All the objective circumstances, the work, the neighborhoods, the houses, everything else remains the same. Okay? And so now the question was, so this NGO has, so this is not us, it's the NGO who has done this, and they've done it for over a period of 10, 15 years. And they have a lot of anecdotal evidence that this is actually central to what they do. So this is not about providing information. This is about essentially shocking this particular aspect of aspirations. It's an internal constraint. So what we did was we talked to them and we said that, okay, look, what we want to understand is we want to isolate the impact of exposure to this dream building on psychological measures and so on for women in this community, but also we want to see whether this has an impact on their behavior. And what we'll do is we'll do this through a randomized control trial. So this is what we have done. We have done some pilot. So all that I can report to you at this point are some pilot data from the pilot study which has been concluded, and now we're in the process of scaling it up. The pilot was very small. We didn't really think that we would get any kind of results from the pilot study. So we had about 30 women in the treatment group and about 8 women in the control group. So let me just report to you very quickly what the results of the pilot are. And somewhat surprisingly, so if you do a pre versus post analysis, you see that, and this is the key thing, the key row to keep in mind, and you see that in some sense exposure to dream building has in some sense all the kind of effects that you want it to have. It goes in the right direction, and these are statistically significant, and therefore they have an asterisk. But pre versus post analysis only looks at the treatment group, and you might ask yourself, okay, even at the level of the pilot, whether this effect disappears if you look at treatment versus control, and surprisingly it does not. So this is with 30 people, with 30 women in the treatment group and 8 women in the control group, okay? And even with these very small numbers, we are seeing these statistically significant effects of exposure to dream building on things like self-confidence, locus of control, etc. Okay, and what we are doing now is we are scaling this study up to 400 participants, and the idea would be that, and then we'll one limitation of this exercise is of course that we haven't really looked at outcome measures because of the small scale. We didn't really look at outcome measures, but it will be exactly those outcome measures that we'll be interested in when we in this scaled up work. And that's where I want to come back to the point that you made about the trust and so on. So when it's for example, and this manifests itself for women from this community, it manifests itself in the following way. There is no law in India that prevents. You see, if you that prevents these women from putting their savings in a standard bank account. So they can go to a bank, and there are banks with branches which are like literally 5 meters away from the places where they live and work. Okay, so they can certainly walk to those banks and put money in, but they don't. Instead, they use that money. The typical mode of savings is basically in these chit funds, which are basically an unregulated informal credit market instrument, which are essentially in 99.99% of the cases Ponzi schemes of some sophistication or the other, and they inevitably go bust. So what you have is women in this very disadvantaged, marginalized situation. One route out of this is that because their wages are relatively high to other unskilled workers, they can take that savings, put it in a bank account, in a standard bank account, and then this can be over time, cumulatively, give them more control over their lives and allow them to make the choices they want to make. But you see that although those are formally open to them, okay, it is just that you don't want the sense of shame. You don't want, because the point would be that the teller at the bank would look at the woman in a very different way. And so that thing, that somehow, that you internalize the fact. So this is what I mean by an internal constraint. You internalize the fact that you are disadvantaged, that you are marginalized. and then you impose that as a constraint on your actions, even if formally these actions are available to you, okay? It is precisely that we want to shock through these dream building exercises. And it is precisely that we want to understand better, okay? So one of the things that we want to be interested in, what we're going to try and do is we're going to offer women health insurance schemes or options of savings that go beyond the chit fund stuff, and so we'll see how that works. We don't know, but we'll see how that works out. Okay, so basically that's the kind of thing that I have in mind when I talk about aspirations, failure, and dream building, and so on. There's another, just to give you an idea, there's another piece of work that we're doing in Argentina with Patricio, Anandi, and Fabian. And there we are looking at a different point, which is, does everyone here know about the Simon Bolivar orchestras? And in Venezuela, you have this, so again, there is a lot of survey-based anecdotal evidence that this has a powerful impact on the children who are exposed to these orchestras, albeit they are from very poor neighborhoods, go to very poor schools. But this is a powerful impact not only in their musical abilities, but also in terms of other things like educational attainment outcomes, etc. Okay. Now again, what we wanted to do was we wanted to do this in a properly randomized controlled trial setting. So we got in touch with the Buenos Aires government just as at the point where they were rolling out these orchestras to the poorest barrios around Buenos Aires. And they agreed to do this, this kind of treatment control thing. And what we are doing at the moment is we are essentially, we have done the baseline survey, and what we want to test is we want to test whether regular exposure to these orchestras has a measurable impact on psychological variables like locus of control, etc., but also in terms of educational outcomes, which are not related directly to music. Okay, and again, I think of this, although I could be wrong, but I think of this as essentially an intervention that affects internal constraints, because in some sense you're not really changing the neighborhoods that the children live in, the schools they go to, the friends they have, the parents' income, the variability or the marginality of the lives they live in on other dimensions. You're only looking at this particular thing, and you want to understand what's going on there. So in some sense, I just want to perhaps anticipate a little bit the kind of results that one should only get to this slide after 2 years of doing this work and having very sort of robust empirical findings. But let me sort of presuppose a little bit. Let me kind of jump a little bit directly to the conclusion. And so I think that to the extent to which internal constraints are an additional source of disadvantage over and above external constraints, then this has an important implication for the design of pro-poor interventions. Okay? The first and the most important thing is that even if you have a program that attempts to relax external constraints, okay, the efficacy of such a program may be higher, maybe of a higher order of magnitude, if at the same time you address internal constraints. Okay, that's, if you wish, a weak result, a weak conclusion, but I think a necessary conclusion from this. The second thing is that, formally, like in the case of the women in Kolkata, formally they have a lot of options available to them, okay, but they never take up these options, okay. So it's not as if they are disadvantaged in the sense that they cannot put their money in the bank by law, okay. So in some sense, even to in such cases, directly shocking internal constraints, okay, may actually end up may in itself be a route out of marginalized, out of disadvantage and poverty. Okay, I think that there are other programs that one can talk about where it's important where in some sense changing beliefs is a key aspect of this poverty trap stuff. There is stuff on changing initial aspirations of parents, for example. So the Spoke program in the UK. And then there was Albert Bandura actually had this sort of country-specific soap operas where he tried to promote the use of role models to talk about this stuff.